One of the main reasons I had decided to move out of my downtown apartment and into a private house was the simple luxury of having my own parking space. After years of circling blocks, fighting for spots, and waking up early just to move my car before getting ticketed, I was finally free. No more parallel parking gymnastics, no more squeezing between two SUVs just to open my door. My driveway was mine, or at least that's what I thought. That illusion shattered one quiet Sunday morning. Hey, just before we jump into the crazy details, do us a quick favor. Drop a comment below letting us know which city you're watching from. It might sound small, but it really boosts our channel and helps more people discover these stories. And while you're at it, smash that like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all the insane HOA, Karen, and neighborhood saga videos we've got coming. I had just come back from a grocery run, already picturing myself enjoying a coffee on my porch, when I turned onto my street and saw it, a large silver SUV parked squarely in my driveway. At first, I thought maybe a friend had dropped by unannounced, but as I got closer, I didn't recognize the car. No notes, no signs of movement, just an unfamiliar vehicle comfortably settled in my spot. I pulled over to the curb and stared at it, irritation bubbling up. One of the reasons I left the chaos of city parking behind was to not deal with this. Taking a deep breath, I decided to be reasonable. Maybe it was a delivery driver or a guest who got confused. I went knocking on a few doors, asking if anyone knew whose car it was. That's when I met her. Karen. She was standing outside her house, chatting with an older neighbor, looking perfectly at ease. She had that air of someone who had just moved in but already felt like she ran the place. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my tone polite. "Is that your SUV in my driveway?" She turned to me with a broad smile. "Oh, yeah, that's mine. I just moved in last week. I'm Karen." I nodded, not particularly interested in small talk. "Nice to meet you, Karen. Could you move your car? That's my driveway." Her smile didn't even waver. "Oh, I meant to introduce myself sooner. I just parked there temporarily. My garage is full of boxes and street parking is such a mess. I figured it wouldn't be a problem just for today." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "It is a problem. That's private property." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on, you weren't even home. It's not like I was blocking you in." I clenched my jaw. "That's not the point. I moved here specifically so I wouldn't have to deal with parking issues. Please don't do it again." She let out an exaggerated sigh as if I were the unreasonable one. "Wow, I thought this neighborhood was more neighborly." I didn't respond, just crossed my arms and waited. She finally pulled out her keys and walked to the SUV, grumbling the whole way. As she backed out, she rolled down her window. "You know, a little kindness wouldn't hurt." I ignored her and walked back inside, relieved to have my driveway back. That evening, just as I was settling in with a book, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, there was Karen, standing there with a pie in her hands. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier," she said, smiling. "I really didn't mean to step on any toes. Moving is stressful, and I guess I wasn't thinking." She seemed sincere enough, and I wasn't about to hold a grudge over a parking mistake. I invited her in, made some coffee, and we ended up chatting for nearly an hour. She told me about her old neighborhood, how she was excited for a fresh start, and even mentioned she baked as a hobby. By the time she left, I figured the whole thing was behind us. It wasn't. 2 days later, I pulled into my street after a long day at work, only to find her SUV back in my driveway. This time, she had parked even closer to my garage, making it impossible for me to pull in. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Maybe she had a good reason. Maybe she had a delivery, an emergency, or... No, I had given her the benefit of the doubt once. I parked on the street, got out, and marched straight to her door. It took 3 firm knocks before she answered. She looked surprised, or at least pretended to be. "Oh, hey, everything okay?" she asked, as if I had just dropped by for a chat. "No, Karen, everything is not okay," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Your car is in my driveway, again." Her smile faltered just slightly. "Oh, yeah, I had a contractor over earlier, and he needed my driveway, so I figured I'd just use yours for a bit." I exhaled sharply. "Karen, we talked about this. You can't park in my driveway, ever. It's not a guest spot, it's mine." She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Look, I was going to move it. It's not like you needed it right that second, right? I clenched my jaw. I just got home from work. I do need it. Move your car. She crossed her arms and stared at me like I was being difficult. You know, I really don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Because it is a big deal, Karen. This is my property. I shouldn't have to explain this again. She huffed, but finally went to grab her keys. As she walked past me, she muttered, "Some people are just so territorial." I didn't respond. I just watched as she backed out, taking her time like she was doing me a favor. As I locked my car and headed inside, I had that itchy feeling at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you just know someone is going to be a problem. Like when a coworker says, "We should totally grab lunch sometime," but you both know they'll spend the whole time complaining about their ex. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe Karen really did think my driveway was some kind of communal parking space. Maybe she genuinely didn't understand the concept of private property. Maybe, just maybe, she would see reason. Spoiler alert, she did not see the reason. Because the very next morning, just as I was about to leave for work, I opened my front door, only to find her SUV parked in my driveway again, blocking my car in. I just stood there for a moment, staring, wondering if I had somehow stepped into an alternate reality where this was normal. Maybe in Karen's world, driveways worked like public benches. You just used the closest one and hoped no one would mind. I took a deep breath. A reasonable person would knock on her door and politely ask her to move. A petty person would have called a tow truck immediately. I decided to be a reasonable person. For now, but this time I wasn't so delicate. When Karen answered the door, holding a cup of coffee like she had all the time in the world, I laid it out for her, firmly. "Karen, I don't want to have this conversation every morning. This is private property. If you keep parking in my driveway, I'll have to call a tow truck." She blinked at me, then let out a little laugh. "Oh, come on. You wouldn't actually do that, would you?" I gave her a smile, not a friendly one, more of a try-me kind of smile. "I'd really rather not, but I will if I have to." She sighed dramatically as if I had just asked her to donate a kidney, then muttered, "Fine," and went to move her car. Victory? Not quite. Maybe my polite tone softened the message. Maybe my smile made her think I was joking. Maybe she was just one of those people who only take rules seriously when there's a flashing neon sign that says consequences ahead. Because when I got home that evening, her SUV was right back in my driveway. She hadn't just ignored my warning, she had doubled down. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was war. And in war, all measures are valid. I took out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed the towing service. If Karen wanted to play games, I was about to introduce her to the final boss. "Hello, yes, I need a vehicle removed from my private property," I said, giving them my address. As I waited, I couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting Karen to magically appear and move her car at the last second. But no, her SUV sat there, smug and immovable, like a cat that had claimed a new sleeping spot and refused to budge. 15 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. The driver, a no-nonsense guy who had clearly seen his fair share of parking disputes, gave a low whistle as he eyed the SUV. "Neighbor trouble?" he asked, already reaching for his clipboard. "You have no idea," I sighed. With practiced efficiency, he got to work, hooking Karen's car up with the kind of care you'd expect from someone handling very expensive luggage at the airport. I almost felt bad. Almost. By the time her car was being towed down the street, I was already mentally preparing for the next phase of battle. Because if I knew anything about Karen, it was that she wasn't going to take this quietly. And sure enough, the next morning, the peace of my neighborhood was shattered by a sound that could only be described as a wounded banshee on a warpath. "Where is my car?" I peeked through my blinds just in time to see Karen standing in the middle of my driveway, her phone clutched in one hand, the other dramatically pressed against her forehead like she had just received news of an unspeakable tragedy. She spun in circles, scanning the street as if her SUV might magically reappear if she just looked hard enough. When that didn't work, she stomped up my front steps and slammed her fist against my door like she was conducting an FBI raid. I took a deep breath, grabbed my coffee, and opened the door with the kind of calm that I knew would drive her absolutely insane. "Oh, good morning, Karen," I said, taking a sip. "You seem..." upset. Upset? She shrieked, eyes bulging. You had my car towed? Are you insane? I leaned against the doorframe, giving her my best innocent neighbor look. Karen, I warned you repeatedly, but you kept parking in my driveway like it was your personal garage. What did you expect? She huffed, her face turning an alarming shade of red. You could have just talked to me. I did talk to you, several times actually, remember? The conversations, the gentle warnings about consequences? Karen waved a dismissive hand as if facts were just minor inconveniences. You had no right. Actually, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and scrolling, according to local property laws, I had every right. I turned the screen toward her, showing the exact statute about private driveways and trespassing. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You need to fix this, she finally sputtered. I smiled. Oh, I did fix it. The problem was your car in my driveway. Now it's gone. Problem solved. Karen let out an inhuman screech, then jabbed a finger at me. You haven't heard the last of this? I watched as she stomped back toward her house, then shut my door, shaking my head. The war wasn't over. This was just the opening battle. For a week, there was silence. No SUV parked in my driveway. I cautiously allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Karen had gotten the message. I parked without incident, enjoyed my evenings without the looming threat of a car blocking my way, and even began to think that maybe we could coexist as neighbors. But as it always happens with these things, peace was fleeting. I pulled into my driveway after another exhausting day at work, only to see her SUV back in its familiar spot, this time even more crooked, almost as if she was daring me to do something about it. The car was practically leaning against my garage, as if to say, "You're not getting in here unless I say so." I let out a frustrated sigh, feeling the knot of tension re-tighten in my chest. This was it. She was back to her old ways. She must have thought a week off was enough to let the dust settle before she returned to claim what she thought was her rightful space. I didn't bother to knock on her door this time. I wasn't in the mood for polite conversations or diplomacy. I took out my phone and dialed the tow service. Again. Within the hour, the tow truck rolled up and I could feel a sense of vindication settle over me as I watched her car being hitched up and hauled away. I wasn't just taking action. I was winning. When the truck drove off, I felt like a general after a successful campaign. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone yelling. I knew exactly who it was. There, standing in front of her house, was Karen, fuming. Her hands were on her hips, and her eyes were practically shooting daggers in my direction. She was staring at the empty spot where her car had been. I could almost hear her blood pressure rising from here. She stomped over to my yard, barely looking at me as she marched right up to my door. "Where's my car?" she demanded, her voice high-pitched and shaky with anger. I leaned against the doorframe, barely containing my amusement. "It got towed," I said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. "I told you last time, Karen," I said calmly, cutting through her theatrics. "This is my private property. I can have cars towed off if they're parked here without permission." Without warning, she pulled out her phone, dialing with a furious intensity. I stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her next move. A few seconds later, I heard her voice high-pitched and screeching. "Yes, I need to report an emergency. Someone just had my car towed illegally. This is harassment." I raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed by the sheer audacity. Of course, she wasn't just going to accept it. I could hear her rattling off her side of the story to the officer on the other end, describing in dramatic detail how I was bullying her and abusing my power. I rolled my eyes, already predicting the conversation. A few minutes later, 2 uniformed officers arrived at my house. They walked up the driveway with a look of polite confusion, probably trying to figure out if this was a simple neighbor dispute or something more serious. I greeted them with a calm smile, hoping to give them as little ammunition as possible. "Good morning, officers," I said as sweetly as possible. "Can I help you?" One officer, a man with a stern face and a no-nonsense vibe, glanced over at Karen, still pacing in front of her house. "We've received a call about a car being towed illegally. Can you tell us your side of the story?" I nodded, walking them over to the empty space where Karen's SUV had been parked. "Well, I own this property and my driveway is not public. Karen here has been parking in my driveway multiple times without my permission. I've asked her nicely before, but when the car was blocking my access, I had no choice but to call a tow truck. Karen, standing by with her arms crossed, jumped in. That's a lie! He's harassing me! I'm new to the neighborhood and I didn't know the rules. He's just trying to get rid of me. I kept my cool. I spoke with her last week about this. I even gave her a friendly warning about the potential consequences if it happened again. Karen took a step forward, now practically shaking with indignation. You can't just do this. I'm going to take this to the HOA. I'll have you fined for all of this. You'll see. I could see the officers trying to suppress smirks at her outburst. The older officer gave her a firm look, then turned to me. Well, it seems like there's a misunderstanding here, but from what we're hearing, you're within your rights to call for a tow if someone's blocking your driveway. Just make sure to document your conversations with her and keep it civil. I nodded. Of course, I've been trying to keep it civil. It's just frustrating when someone keeps pushing boundaries. As they walked back to their patrol car, Karen was still shouting after them. You'll regret this. I'm calling the HOA right now. I just watched them go, shaking my head. At least for now, I was still on top. And if I had to keep calling tow trucks to win the war, I was ready. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the situation escalated. First, it was the HOA. One afternoon, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. The HOA had apparently received a concern from Karen about unprofessional behavior on my part and harassment regarding the parking situation. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing when I read her complaint. She'd actually used the phrase gross misuse of power. I immediately contacted the HOA office and politely explained the situation. They seemed to be leaning toward siding with Karen until I mentioned the multiple times I had warned her in writing and verbally. Suddenly, they were a lot more neutral on the matter. But Karen wasn't finished. She started gathering support from other neighbors. You could tell because every time I stepped outside, I'd see them whispering in huddled groups, shooting me looks that ranged from awkward pity to full-on judgment. Great. Just what I needed. And then came the big move. Karen organized a neighborhood meeting under the guise of open communication about parking. Of course, it was really a platform for her to unleash her dramatic interpretation of the events. That evening, the HOA board set up folding chairs in the community center, and Karen was already sitting at the front like she was giving a TED Talk on the oppression of Karen types everywhere. She stood up and dramatically recounted the terrible experience she'd had with me, painting herself as the victim of a heartless, unreasonable neighbor who had no respect for personal space or community. It was like watching a soap opera, but with more baked goods and less drama on screen. When it was finally my turn to speak, I calmly explained the situation from my perspective, the whole parking in my driveway thing, the multiple attempts to resolve the issue, and then I dropped the bomb. Just to clarify, I said, I've been very patient with Karen and had even warned her several times before this became an issue. And if we want to discuss community relations, I'm happy to share the documentation of her parking habits, times, dates, photos, you name it. You could feel the collective gasps in the room. A few of the neighbors who had been nodding along with Karen suddenly seemed uncomfortable. One of the HOA members, a guy who'd barely spoken up until now, raised his hand. Wait. So you've actually been trying to work with her? I nodded. Exactly. I didn't want this to escalate, but sometimes people need, well, consequences for their actions. The room fell into an awkward silence as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, one of them spoke. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we could all sit down and resolve this like adults? Karen's face was a mix of fury and disbelief as the HOA made it clear they were closing the case thanks to the overwhelming evidence I presented. The board nodded in agreement, affirming that I had every right to protect my property. They agreed the situation was clear. She had no grounds to park in my driveway. Karen attempted to argue, but the board wasn't having it. They told her politely but firmly that the matter was resolved. As the meeting ended, she stormed out, her hands shaking with frustration, already making plans to appeal, though it was obvious she was losing this battle. After the meeting, I decided it was time to reinforce the message. I put up a private property no parking sign just to make sure there was no ambiguity. A few days later, I overheard the new neighbors gossiping that Karen had stopped by their house, spreading lies about me and how I'd supposedly been harassing her. But no one bought her story. From that day on, Karen never looked me in the eyes again. She'd try to avoid any interaction, always walking by with her head down. As for me, I just enjoyed the peace of finally having my driveway back. I hope you enjoyed the story I shared with you. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories and updates. Your subscription helps me create even more exciting content. Until next time.